if we reject the dialectic of Saturn at the end of the day, and we actually truly understand historical necessity, and that the alternatives do exist in every revolution, then the future, the possibilities for revolution and liberation, emancipation, are still open for us. Communism can still be our future.
Welcome to All That's Left, a podcast from Left Voice. My name is Oden. Today's episode is about a major question that casts a dark shadow over socialism and its history. And that question is, doesn't socialism inevitably lead to Stalinism, into mass murder, gulags, repression, totalitarianism? In other words, there's this idea that Stalinism was the unavoidable fate of the Russian Revolution. Anti-communists embrace this view because they see Stalinism as an evil force springing seemingly out of nowhere. And from the right, anti-communists like Winston Churchill, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and of course Adolf Hitler on the very far right, saw communism as a dangerous virus, and they often tied it to subversive Jews. Historically, though, anti-communism doesn't just come from the right. There is and has been a version of this idea on the left too. Maybe most notably from figures like George Orwell, the author of 1984 and Animal Farm, who saw Stalinism and communism as totalitarian and stemming from a lust for power. Like the right-wing anti-communists, the idea here from more progressive sectors is, once again, that Stalinism is pure evil, coming out of the blue, without really an attempt to understand the forces that actually led to Stalin's rise. On the other hand, we have the supporters of Stalin and the Soviet Union, particularly from the world's communist parties, who argued that Stalinism was a historical necessity and the only way for the working class to reach the glorious end goal of communism. According to this reasoning, whatever compromises the Soviet Union made, these were a necessary price to pay as part of the iron laws of history. Whoever opposed Stalinism, this reasoning went, was opposed to the working class and to history itself. So, on the surface, the two views that I just described might sound like two completely opposed approaches to understanding Stalinism. One approach taken by anti-communists, particularly during the Cold War, and the other one taken by the Soviet bureaucracy's supporters and by apologists for Stalinism. But what both of these sides fundamentally agree on here is that there was no alternative to Stalinism, whether it's portrayed as a savior or as the Antichrist. And if there's no alternative to Stalinism, then every attempt at liberation leads to a repressive dictatorship, to terror. And that would mean that there's no emancipatory potential in socialist revolution. But was the Russian Revolution doomed to fail? Does socialism necessarily lead to Stalinism? The answer to both of these questions, we argue, is no. Both the anti-communists and the pro-Stalinist perspectives take an ahistorical approach without a material analysis of Stalin's counter-revolution. So why did the Russian Revolution degenerate and lead to Stalinist terror? Obviously, this is a very complicated question to answer, but Stalinism was the result of concrete material conditions in the Soviet Union. Although the Bolsheviks won the Civil War in 1921, the war had decimated the working class and the workers' councils, also known as the Soviets, and it pretty much left the economy in ruins. On top of this, the Soviet Union was also very isolated, since revolutions had been defeated most notably in Germany, but also elsewhere. And so it was in the context of this political void, as well as this economic devastation and scarcity, that the Soviet bureaucracy, centered around Stalin, managed to solidify its rule. This historical materialist approach, which was adopted by Leon Trotsky, doesn't look at Stalinism in a framework of good or evil, damnation or salvation, It doesn't assert that Stalinism was spontaneous and completely ununderstandable. The historical materialist approach actually shows us that Stalinism wasn't preordained or written in the stars. It wasn't the fulfillment of Bolshevism. Material circumstances and processes of class struggle gave rise to Stalinism and its terrors, as well as to the betrayal of workers and of international revolutions. Today I'm joined by independent Marxist historian Doug Greene. He's the author of a new book called Stalinism and the Dialectics of Saturn, Anti-Communism, Marxism, and the Fate of the Soviet Union. Doug and I discuss what characterized Stalinism, like his politics of socialism in one country, as well as the approaches to understanding Stalinism that I described earlier, which framed Stalinism as an inevitability. We then discuss Stalinism from a historical materialist perspective, drawing on Trotsky's analysis, and we also explore why Stalin's death in 1953 didn't end the Stalinist bureaucracy or herald an era of socialism. And finally, we discuss why this debate is still so important today. As Doug writes, quote, "The Stalinist outcome in Russia was not a fated outcome as if preordained by some god of history. Stalinism can only be claimed as inevitable by ignoring the communist roads not taken." Unquote. So, understanding Stalinism isn't just about understanding the past, it's about envisioning the future. Doug is also the author of A Failure of Vision, Michael Harrington and the Limits of Democratic Socialism, which I interviewed him about last year. I'll link to that episode in the show notes. I strongly recommend it. He is also the author of Communist Insurgent, Blanky's Politics of Revolution, and he has a forthcoming book on Karl Kautsky and Neo-Kautskyism entitled The Renegade's Revenge. I'll link to his books and work in the show notes. You can also request that your library order a copy. As always, if you enjoy this podcast, make sure to smash the subscribe button, share it with your friends, your comrades, and leave us a nice review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It helps a lot. If you are able to support us, because we are a volunteer-run publication and podcast, you can do so at patreon.com/leftvoice and follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok under the handle left_voice. Here's my interview with Doug Greene. Doug, welcome to the podcast again.
Thank you so much for having me on today.
Yeah, I'm really excited to dig into this book, and I wanted to start by asking about the very intriguing title, which is Stalinism and the Dialectics of Saturn, which is a concept that you refer to throughout the book itself. And so I wanted to ask, what is the story behind this title, and what does a dialectic of Saturn refer to?
It's a great question, and it's thankfully answered on the first page of the book. But the dialectic of Saturn, it goes all the way back to Greco-Roman mythology, where the god Saturn ate his children lest they succeed him and overthrow him. So, and this term of Saturn eating his children was used during the French Revolution, when people were being guillotined during the Reign of Terror, and it's saying, like, the revolution is like Saturn. It devours its own children. And this was uttered by reactionaries, liberals, as, revolutions go too far. They're bound to end, even if they promise liberation and a new society of justice and egalitarianism, they're bound to descend into tyranny and terror. And afterwards, the idea of revolutions being like Saturn and eating their own children was used not only to describe the French Revolution, but subsequent revolutions, whether Russia, China, Cuba, Vietnam, whatever, as, they're always bound to go bad. They're always bound to end in totalitarianism. And the specific phrase dialectic of Saturn, though, was actually coined by the Italian Marxist theorist Domenico Lacerdo. And he's using it in a book called Stalin, the History and Critique of a Black Legend. And he's saying all revolutions undergo a dialectic of Saturn, but he's actually puts a positive spin on it, in the sense that he's saying, the Russian Revolution started with these dreams of egalitarianism, universalism, represented by a figure like Trotsky. But he says, this is not sustainable. And he says revolutions need to give way to pragmatism and realism, the rule of law. And this is represented by the figure of Stalin. So he's saying, this dialectic of Saturn played itself out in the Russian Revolution, with the purges and Stalin's rise to power. And he defends that. And the reason the book takes its title is because originally the book was going to be a series of articles co-written with my friend Harrison Fluss, who wrote the introduction and the book is dedicated to. We were going to critique Lacerdo's defense of Stalin, but for various reasons, Harrison couldn't continue the project. So I went forward. And as I was kind of situating Domenico Lacerdo in Western Marxism and like the Moscow-aligned communist movement, it became clear to me that I was writing a much bigger project than just a critique of Lacerdo, and it was actually a more broader engagement with Stalinism, communism, the Soviet Union. So Lacerdo ended up being the appendix to the book, and a lot of the rest of the book is just dealing with these wider debates. But the Dialectic of Saturn ended up being essentially this framing device that, was referenced throughout the book. And my book is essentially this engagement with our revolutions doomed to go bad, whether the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, what have you. So that's where the title comes from.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think it would be really helpful to set the stage for a conversation at this point to talk a little bit about what Stalinism actually was, because I think a lot of people have a sort of broad understanding of things like the Stalinist purges, some of the other actions of his regime, like the Moscow trials, and I think people have this overall sense that Stalin really ruled with an iron fist. But how do we define Stalinism, and what were the main characteristics of the Stalinist bureaucracy?
Yeah, so my very short, condensed definition that I use in the book is that Stalinism is bureaucratic governance over collectivized property relations that were originally meant to foster Soviet or council democracy. And its governing ideology is that of socialism in one country, which is a nationalist idea, as opposed to proletarian internationalism. So that's a very condensed definition of Stalinism, which comes out of a Trotskyist background. But if you notice, in the book, everyone has different definitions of Stalinism, and some of them, they don't actually use the term Stalinism, they just call it communism. They see it as the logical endpoint. And there's obviously my definition of Stalinism, I've tried to get to what I think is like a very baseline definition, because obviously there is terror in Stalinism, particularly during the 30s. But to say like the whole period is complete terror is a misnomer of what happened, because there are periods where there really isn't a high level of terror. And after Stalin's death, a lot of that type of terror goes away in a mass scale, particularly in the Soviet Union. You don't see real kind of show trials and mass arrests and with Khrushchev onward. But there is still bureaucratic governance. They still uphold socialism in one country, and this would be the same in Eastern Europe as well, where again a lot of like the real extreme elements of Stalinism go away. And again, the nationalist idea is developed in the 20s, but it becomes more pronounced, particularly as Stalin's rule progresses. So there are periods where there's actually like a hyper radicalism when they originally do like the collectivization, and there's attacks on bourgeois culture. And later on, though, there's a reassertion of like traditional family values, nationalism, which gets so extreme during World War II and afterwards that it veers off into let's root out cosmopolitanism, which actually is basically a cover for anti-Semitism. So there are these different aspects at play in Stalinism, and some are more pronounced depending on the period that we're talking about. But I think as a baseline, bureaucratic governance over collectivized property relations and the nationalist idea, those kind of carry over because, again, certain aspects will be more pronounced, whether terror in the 30s, but not earlier or later, etc. So that's kind of how I come down on Stalinism.
Yeah, I think that's a super important point, that it wasn't as if the Soviet Union and communism and Stalinism were the same for decades and decades. I think that's a really, really key point. Your book examines the different perspectives that have been used to understand Stalinism, and then you also show how some of these perspectives are tied to anti-communism. I want to dig into these approaches. The first of which is what you call the bolt from the blue, where Stalinism was basically evil incarnate, or as you put it in the book, quote, a diabolical force with no social roots, but merely a vicious contagion that threatens to enslave humanity. From my recollection of like high school history classes and things like that, this is basically the way that I was taught about Stalin. It's also kind of the way I was taught, I would say, about like Hitler, Mussolini. I want to know a little bit more about this bolt from the blue approach, like what it looked like and why some people drew this conclusion. And I'd also love if you could touch a bit on George Orwell, the author of 1984 and Animal Farm, who I would say is probably the most well known among these proponents from a sort of mainstream point of view.
Okay, that's a great question. I just want to go back a minute to the framework of the book, which I it's set up using Marx's 18th Brumaire, which is Marx is analyzing the rise to power of Napoleon III, who's this mediocrity, and he ends up becoming emperor of France. And he's saying, like, how can a mediocrity end up ruling the most powerful country in Europe? And Marx is analyzing this. And in a preface to the work, he says, there are three perspectives. And he says, there are those like Victor Hugo, the famous writer, intellectual, who view Napoleon's rise as this bolt from the blue, this horrific event that kind of appears out of nowhere. And then there are figures who like celebrate Napoleon, and they see him as an instrument of historical necessity unfolding. This would be someone like Proudhon. And Marx is differentiating himself from that and saying, I'm looking at the class struggle, the material reality that allowed this to happen. So basically, those perspectives are transferred in my book from looking at the rise of Napoleon III to the rise of Stalin. And in terms of the bolt from the blue, it's this idea that Stalinism is this hellspawn. It appears out of nowhere. You know, it is this demonic force. And this idea is, again, it's something that also goes back to the French Revolution, because the reactionaries, they saw the French Revolution as not like the contradictions of the old regime and corruption and like the yearning of the masses for freedom. They see it as like the corrosive virus of reason and the Enlightenment. They hate that. And afterwards, as modern medicine is kind of developing and you have the Industrial Revolution and the working class, the modern working class developing with revolutionary potential, they see this idea of communism as a biological contagion infecting the body politic. And eventually it gets a name, and that name is the Jews. They see the Jews as a carrier of communism, of this virus that will corrode, you know, the body politic. And this is expressed in Russia by the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And during the Russian Civil War, the white armies who were fighting the Bolsheviks, their ideological glue is anti-Semitism. For them, Bolsheviks and Jews are one and the same. So the bolt from the blue sees Judeo-Bolshevism as this virus. And in Germany, it's most famously expressed by Adolf Hitler and the forces around the Nazi Party. They see the Jews as a leveling force for democracy. They see communism as this Jewish virus. And with Hitler, he sees his main enemy in the Soviet Union, which is ruled by this Jewish cabal. So when the Wehrmacht invades in 1941, it's a genocidal war by design. They're like, we will have no prisoners. We will annihilate these people because it's a virus, and we want to just destroy them. So that's the most extreme genocidal version of this bolt from the blue. Someone like Winston Churchill also sees internationalist Jews as a force behind communism, but he does kind of like Zionist and patriotic Jews. And the Russian, or the Soviet dissident, I should say, Alexander Solzhenitsyn also blames the Jews for Bolshevism. And if you notice, I'm not making any differentiation between Stalinism, Trotskyism, or communism, because they see it as one and the same. It's all the same pernicious virus. It has no roots. It just kind of comes. And if you also notice, they're not really interested in like the material relations or the class struggle. It's this irrational view. And later on, during the Cold War, the virus is called totalitarianism. And it is, especially as you get in from like the 50s, 60s later with people like, again, Solzhenitsyn, Jacob Tallman, Robert Conquest, Richard Pipes, all these kind of people, Leszek Kolakowski, who are all like these major anti-communist intellectuals. They see totalitarianism as the logical end root of all communism. There is no non-Stalinist communism. It's all the same. And it has its roots in reason, the Enlightenment, this idea that human beings can rationally understand and change the world. That is the root of the virus. And it gets its most developed form, I argue, in the Black Book of Communism, where it sees communism basically as the worst evil to ever befall humanity, with its roots in this Promethean idea that human beings can change the world, but they end up creating hell on earth, totalitarianism. Now, not all of these Bolt from the Blues are necessarily anti-Semitic. They take different forms. In some figures of the totalitarian school, they don't really emphasize it. Others do. And Orwell is kind of a left variant of this Bolt from the Blue. Now, Orwell is obviously an English writer. He's most well known for books like Homage to Catalonia, about the Spanish Civil War, Animal Farm, 1984. And he does identify as a democratic socialist. But one thing about Orwell that's important to note is even in his more openly avowed socialist period, he's really not interested in Marxist theory or understanding like class struggle. He kind of disdains, like, oh, we don't need dialectical materialism. We don't need that. We just need to fight for justice and the common decency. And even when he's in Spain fighting for the far left, the POUM, he doesn't really understand the causes of the Spanish Civil War. He actually bemoans the fact that there are all these factions, which he doesn't actually get right. People forget that the POUM, Orwell makes it like they're in favor of this anarchist militia. But if you actually read the POUM program, they're like, no, we want a Red Army. In fact, we want the dictatorship of the proletariat. And he doesn't get that. Now, this is not to say that Orwell is completely wrong about things. He's very correct in like Homage to Catalonia, looking at the propagandas that was done to besmirch and slander the POUM as a bunch of Nazi agents, which is, again, wrong. And in 1984, he's very interested in how, like, these totalitarian regimes are able to manipulate the truth and everything. But he never really gets surface level. He can never really understand why. And it should be noted that even in the 30s, when he's kind of close to some like dissident communists around like Trotskyism, he sees the Bolshevik Revolution as basically bad from the beginning. He thinks Trotsky was just as much to blame for Bolshevism as Lenin and Stalin. And this becomes more pronounced later on. And Orwell basically takes a very surface level view. He disdains this theory, and he thinks like, Marxist theory to understand things. So he just thinks it kind of comes. And his source for totalitarianism is, well, there's this sadistic lust for power in people, power for the sake of power. Let's just dominate. Let's do cruelty for the sake of cruelty. And he's picking this up from a lot of stuff in the air. People like James Burnham, who was a former Trotskyist, who eventually turns to become a reactionary, founds National Review. And he's kind of swept up in like a lot of the initial period of the Cold War. And it's often forgot that Orwell was willing to give names of dissidents to the British government. Orwell said in letters, I will side with America in a war with Russia. Now, he always maintained this kind of idiosyncratic socialism of his own. English socialism is very strange. We'll give freedom to India, but we'll keep the monarchy. It doesn't make sense to me. And he still claims, even in books like Animal Farm in 1984, I'm not arguing against socialism per se. I'm just arguing against, those dastardly Reds and those totalitarians. but it's picked up by anti-communists, and as basically one of their major texts is actually smuggled into Eastern Europe, books like Animal Farm in 1984. So it may not have been in his intention, but it was certainly his result. And or the part of the reason I think Orwell's idea of Big Brother, this sadistic totalitarian monsters, was so it caught fire so much. It was not like the same discredited ideas of Judeo-Bolshevism, which probably was not the most politically astute thing to advance, like right after World War II and the Holocaust. But Orwell kind of served that function. So even though Orwell sometimes has this reputation as this left-wing revolutionary thinker and activist, I really don't think it's true if you look at like the whole sweep of his work. And he really is developing a left-wing variant of Bolt from the Blue. Because if you read Orwell, you're really not going to understand, I think, the origins of the Russian Revolution or Stalinism or the various alternatives that could have been pursued. You're just going to see, well, it's bound to go bad because of the sadistic, power-hungry Big Brother.
It seems in some cases, like you're just talking about, some of these sectors just didn't really understand Stalin and Stalinism. Like when you talk about Orwell, you mentioned that he wasn't interested in theory very much. He was more interested in, like justice and freedom and stuff like that. I wanted to go to a quote though that you have early on in the book where you say that the principal usage of the bolt from the blue idea is meant to defend the existing socioeconomic order, racial supremacy, and imperial domination. Can you talk a little bit about this bolt from the blue approach from the perspective of like what like political goals it achieved to put forward this idea and this understanding of Stalinism?
Right. So the bolt from the blue was someone like Churchill, who's arguing against internationalist Jews. He is obviously defending things like the British Empire, the monarchy, and the basic class structure. And if you think about it, this idea that Winston Churchill, for instance, is this figure who's interested in freedom from totalitarianism, from enslavement, is really kind of laughable when the British Empire is subjugating hundreds of millions of people across the world in their colonial empire. And he sees, Churchill actually says like communism is like a revolt against the white race. It is this pernicious, idea of leveling and democracy taken to extremes. And a lot of these major figures in the bolt from the blue are defending, entrenched class structures, entrenched inequality, Hitler, etc. But the bolt from the blue, when it takes its real form, its form of totalitarianism during the Cold War, it is an ideological weapon. Because before 1945, there really wasn't such a thing, at least in the United States, as Soviet studies. But after World War II and the defeat of the Third Reich, a new enemy to the United States emerges, and that's the Soviet Union. And the United States, the government, wants to understand this enemy. So suddenly you see government, business, all these kind of foundations, they're funding Soviet studies, and they drive, with like a specifically anti-communist agenda. And they drive out any radicals that are in academia. And they developed this theory called totalitarianism. It kind of was in the air beforehand with different people kind of wondering, what it meant. But it takes its form as an anti-communist weapon after 45 with people like Hannah Arendt and this idea of a total government, of total control over the state, society, reaching into the very souls of people to subjugate and dominate them. And it really doesn't understand, it sees a very simple narrative of Lenin's this elitist who wants to subjugate people, and the Bolsheviks take power in a coup. Eventually, Stalin kind of emerges with this program of world domination. He dominates Soviet society, and everyone is motivated by power and domination. And it became this weapon to discredit any idea of alternatives. So all communism in the totalitarian school is necessarily Stalinist. It's necessarily totalitarian. Like there really is, for these figures, there really is no difference between Trotsky, Bukharin, and Stalin. And so totalitarianism, its partly to understand the Soviet Union as this total state bent on world conquest. And it doesn't actually serve to understand the Soviet Union because it sees totalitarianism. Once you have it, it's frozen, it doesn't change, which is not true. There was, basically they think that there was these debates after Stalin died. Well, totalitarianism is going to continue; it's never going to lessen or lighten up. And dissidents from that, like the Marxist historian Isaac Deutscher, was like, no, there's going to be reform. They're going to loosen up a bit. And this was actually kind of laughed at the time, but he was proven correct. So on the one hand, it doesn't actually help you understand the Soviet Union because there were more liberalization periods, but it's also meant to discredit any idea of a challenge to private property, any idea of a challenge to imperialism, because it's meant to discredit all the student rebels. It's meant to discredit Trotskyists, anarchists, Maoists, whomever is, challenging capitalism. Oh, you're all going to end as totalitarians. You're all going to create hell on earth. So it has that. So it's an ideological weapon. And with things like the Black Book of Communism, if you accept its arguments, then communism is the worst thing ever. It's killed 100 million people. It should note they fudged all those numbers. And it's kind of interesting who they include in those victims of communism, like all those collaborators on the Eastern Front. But if you accept that, then Trotsky, Stalin, etc., they're all the same. And it is meant to buttress private property. And furthermore, if you look at some of these major figures of the totalitarian school, they're not only propagating this message, but a lot of them are in bed with some very unsavory institutions. So Richard Pipes, he's not only an employee of Harvard University, which is funded by the government, he's working for the Nixon and Reagan administrations. He's part of the CIA. He's helping them to, engage in, support death squads in Central America. And you telling me you're going to trust this man's view on the Soviet Union? Or there's another figure, Ernst Nolte, who is a big defender of the Nazi Martin Heidegger. And he thought that the Nazis launched a preemptive war against the Soviet Union in 1941. So they're defending, capitalist society. They're defending all these kind of inequalities and oppressions. And they're all tied to some very unsavory groups and institutions. Like when you think that the Wehrmacht, slaughtering Jews is some kind of lesser evil to the Soviet Union, there's something gone wrong there. But it is it has a logic behind it where if you think communism is this great evil because it's threatening to erode all society and civilization with its Jewish virus, with its totalitarian reason, then it makes sense to side with some of these forces. So the bolt from the blue, it operates at multiple levels. It has many different adherents, but it's really useless to understand the Soviet Union. It's meant to discredit communism in any variety or form, and it's ultimately reactionary in pretty much every way. And it needs to be completely rejected by anyone who wants to understand communism, the Soviet Union, Stalinism, or what have you.
Yeah, that's really clarifying, and I think it's really interesting and important to hear how this approach is not just about like a lack of understanding or like intellectual laziness, but actually serves these several political purposes. So the approach we just talked about was adopted by many anti-communists, and certainly, as you mentioned, there was overlap there with anti-Semitism, anti-Semites. The next approach that you discuss in the book is what you call historical necessity, which was adopted by the Soviet Union supporters in the world's communist parties, so the Stalinists, Stalin supporters. You write that according to these sectors, quote, communism was the end goal of history, and Stalinism was the only way for the working class to reach this glorious future. Anyone who opposed the historical necessity of Stalinism stood against the working class, reason, and the will of history itself. In the foreword to the book, Harrison Fluss calls this approach, quote, a quasi-mystical force demanding acquiescence. Can you describe this perspective a little bit more, this understanding of Stalinism?
Sure. So to go back to what is historical necessity, is in the Marxist understanding, influenced by major figures of rationalism like Spinoza and Hegel, is we want to understand the world, and we understand the world has natural and social laws. And if we understand those natural and social laws, then we can effectively intervene in the world. We can know the world, its laws, etc. So we understand capitalism has these inherent contradictions that lead it to crisis and breakdown. And the next stage of history is socialism and communism. So it's argued that by the members of the world communist parties that Stalinism is this next stage. It is the only path for the working class to reach communism. And all the compromises, any backsliding, etc., is part of this twisted road that will eventually get you to communism. So if you're a member of the Communist Party, you're following orders, you're defending Stalin and everything that you're expected to do as a party member, you are acting in accordance with the will of history, with necessity. So you will defend everything from the purges, the Moscow trials, the non-aggression pact, the anti-cosmopolitan campaign. You'll defend it all. But if you stand against that, then you're actually going against the will of history. If you are, opposing it in any way, whether this is like people like Trotsky or Bukharin or dissidents within like the various communist parties, you're seen as going against the will of history. You're a traitor. And the one writer, Arthur Kessler, he was originally a member of the German Communist Party, and he later became an anti-communist. And he kind of dramatized the dilemmas of historical necessity in his famous book called Darkness at Noon, which is about a fictionalized old Bolshevik who is in prison during the purges for his opposition, and he comes to confess fantastic crimes that he knows he didn't commit, that his prosecutors know he doesn't commit. But he confesses willingly because he accepts the party is always right. I must confess for the will of history because my opposition is ultimately going against history. I am a traitor to history. So for Kessler, this idea of historical necessity is a totalitarian logic. And if you notice, when I talked about the anti-communists, there was this very religious kind of imagery of Stalinism and communism as demonic and like devilish and from hell itself. Well, you kind of reverse that a bit here because obviously for members of communist parties, they see Stalin as like this great father figure, the father of all peoples, as it was said in the propaganda of the day, as this torchbearer of communism, as a savior, as an angelic figure, actually. So if you see Stalin as a savior, then it's very easy to see Trotsky as a Judas or the Antichrist or a devil himself. In fact, Trotsky was actually called like a Judas in like official Soviet propaganda at the time. So for the members of the communist parties, they see the inexorable unfolding of the will of history is carried out by Stalin and his program. And it's because this is the only path to communism, it means like you might have like someone like a Trotsky or a Bukharin or whomever else is saying, no, we can do this. We don't have to follow the Stalin path. But for them, for the defenders of historical necessity, it's unrealistic. It's romantic. It doesn't engage with practical ideas the way Stalin is supposed to have done. And that's the best they would say. Otherwise, it's just like, oh, this is a wrecking conspiracy. It's not a real alternative because there is no alternative. It's Stalin's way or the highway, basically. So it is a very like fatalistic view of the unfolding of history with historical necessity. And obviously people who fall within the communist parties and the broader camp of Western Marxism, some of them are very comfortable with it. Some of them rebel against it. Some of them, take it with like, they're kind of gritting their teeth about the compromises they have to make. But if you kind of accept that it's basically, Stalin is the only path to communism, then it's like, you might be uncomfortable with it, you might hate it, but you really are kind of stuck with it because you can't actually envision any alternative to it.
Yeah, I found it really helpful to learn about this perspective because, as I've said on this podcast many times before, I'm like fairly new to Marxism, to socialism. And so I think sometimes people have this idea about Stalinists and Stalinism that it's like, this group of people who are just, weirdos who say they love mass murder and they love show trials, but I think it's really helpful to get this understanding that like it was more the perspective that like, well, this is maybe unfortunate, this is maybe kind of brutal, but at the same time it was necessary in the grand scheme of things, and it's necessary to getting us to a socialist future.
Right. I do think that many of the people who joined the communist parties, they did so for probably the very best of reasons. We want to organize unions, we want to fight racism, we want to fight fascism. So in that sense, it's like they weren't all like, you will find these people on Twitter, obviously, and other places, but in the high point in like the 30s or the 40s, people were joining the communist parties for very good and noble reasons. Unfortunately, there were these compromises involved, and it can get very cynical depending on how high in the communist parties you rise. Like some of these party leaders were just like sycophants and really cynical about how they viewed things. Some just kind of, shrugged their shoulders and like, what are we going to do? There were obviously those, particularly in places where like, Stalinism gets power, where they are engaged in purges and some horrific crimes. But a lot of them just see it's like, we got to do what we got to do. It's ugly, it's terrible, but, this is what has to happen because there is no alternative to this. Stalin is our only hope. And everything else is just, it's just a path to treason and being a renegade from history. So again, there are some people who really salivate at this, but again, I think the majority of people who joined the communist parties did not necessarily want to engage in mass slaughter or anything like that. But in a lot of cases, they did find themselves apologizing or justifying it, Stalinism in various ways, and it ties you in all kinds of knots, which is why, like in the United States, when like Khrushchev, exposed a lot of Stalin's crimes, the Communist Party essentially lost a majority of its members because they were horrified that suddenly here's a Soviet leader saying someone we had followed for decades and defended against every criticism, saying, well, he actually engaged in these horrific crimes. So I think you can kind of see there, some of them were just, they might have fooled themselves, they might have accepted it, but they couldn't maintain the lie any longer, basically.
So this kind of brings us to the third approach to understanding Stalinism, which is historical materialism, which was espoused by Leon Trotsky, among others. And it's an approach that does not see Stalinism as a natural or necessary evolution of Bolshevism. So where did Stalinism come from, if not from as a bolt from the blue or as the inevitable result of socialist revolution? What set Trotsky's approach apart from the other approaches that we've discussed? In particular, what sets historical materialism apart from historical necessity?
Right. So to answer this, let's go back a minute. And in terms of Dialectics of Saturn, when you look at the Russian Tsarism and the forthcoming revolution, a lot of the revolutionaries in Russia, and not just there, they saw a lot of similarities to what had happened in France in 100 years before. It's a decrepit old regime. There's a lot of inequality. The peasants are, severely oppressed, and there's this new intelligentsia and working class, etc. And they think, we're facing our 1789 and our 1793. So the French Revolution for a lot of Marxists and Bolsheviks in Russia is essentially, it's inspiring them to, who's going to be our Napoleon, our Danton, our Saint-Just, and all these kind of figures. And it's really all of them. Lenin, Plekhanov, Martov. Trotsky is probably the most prominent, but he's not the only one. So they're kind of seeing that, the French Revolution inspires like the idea of revolutionary government under the Jacobins. But at the same time, it's inspiring them. There's also the fear, like, well, who's going to be our Napoleon? How, can we avoid this revolution going bad? And so in 1917, when the revolution actually does happen, there are people who are potential Napoleons, Kerensky, Kornilov, but they really don't kind of catch on as a Napoleon figure. And there is kind of this fear, well, the Russian Revolution will end in Bonapartism and purges and all of this by design. And in the 20s, after the Civil War is won, there is this fear actually that Trotsky will be the Napoleon figure, because he's like Napoleon. He's a brilliant military commander. He's young, dashing, charismatic. But Trotsky actually understands these analogies better than the people who are disingenuously criticizing him for that, and he refuses to do that. So it's kind of asked, like, well, where does this Stalinism come from? Because Trotsky himself, and I argue at length about this in the book, is he comes up with an alternative to Stalinism in real time in the 20s about how to revitalize the Soviets, have a cultural transformation, put more emphasis on the international revolution, gradual collectivization, which I think is very practical, and for various reasons it doesn't get adopted. But it's important to note that it is an alternative to Stalinism. And as Trotsky is kind of driven from power in exile, he's kind of wondering, well, where is, this degeneration of the revolution coming from? Is it Bolshevism? Is it something else? And it kind of takes some time for him to kind of fully develop the perspective. But he's basically using, the analogies from the French Revolution to argue, listen, the material conditions are kind of what leads to Stalinism. The devastation, isolation of the revolution, and scarcity in Russia kind of create a political vacuum where the working class is kind of reduced to impotence, and this new bureaucracy arises centered around Stalin, and it's able to kind of take power. And it does kind of defend, to a certain extent, the collectivized property relations, but it certainly isn't defending things like proletarian democracy. And he's saying, we can put history back on course. So we can, the Soviet workers need to rise up and overthrow this bureaucracy and restore the power of council democracy and move history forward. Or if we don't do that, capitalism will be restored by the bureaucracy. And he doesn't see this as inevitable, because he thinks, this is specific material conditions in Russia that kind of lead to this. He says, in a more developed country, there might still be the danger of bureaucracy, true, but it's not going to be as pronounced, because if suddenly you have a scarcity of resources, you need to have police, you need to have this kind of whole apparatus to deal with it, and that kind of leads to the stratum of bureaucratic rule. And I think Trotsky's actually able to understand that not only were there specific material conditions that led to the rise of Stalinism, so it wasn't something kind of demonic or hell spawn or the unfolding of his necessity. The other thing is, he offered, both when in the 1920s, when he was still in the party, he offers an alternative to it, an actual path that could have been taken. And we can argue night and day about it, but I think it's an actual comprehensive platform for socialist renewal in the Soviet Union. And after being driven from power, he does have this path saying, listen, the workers can overthrow the bureaucracy and restore Soviet democracy. So there were alternatives. He offered them. And I think his path kind of avoids the pseudo-fatalism of Stalinism, that this is the only way of things are going to go. And it also avoids the pitfalls of anti-communism, because he doesn't see the Soviet Union as a frozen society. And unlike, he sees it as, in a certain sense, we defended against imperialism. That's our main enemy. But we recognize that this bureaucracy is committing terrible crimes that are against socialism and communism. We need to overthrow it. So he's actually able to walk a tightrope. Sometimes it's a very narrow tightrope, but he's actually able to go that path and avoid these kind of Scylla and Charybdis, to use the metaphor from the Odyssey, of these dangerous reefs. And I think it is a useful tool for Marxist renewal to understand the development of Stalinism and the possibilities that were not taken in 20th century socialism. And that, I think, he's actually able to, if you use Trotsky and you understand things like the revolution betrayed, I think you come away with the conclusion that the dialectic of Saturn, whether it's used by the anti-communists in a negative sense, or the communists in the communist parties in a positive sense, is actually a pseudo-dialectic. It actually obscures history. It actually doesn't understand the real laws of determinism, necessity, material relations, and class struggle. And we need to go back, to Trotsky and kind of this classical Marxist perspective to kind of get past all of all of these false perspectives that kind of obscure history, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And I think also Trotsky had, I feel like, a very useful rebuttal to this idea of like the unique evil of Stalinism. And from my understanding, he did start writing a biography of Stalin, but ultimately didn't complete it. But I wanted to quote something he said in front of the Dewey Commission inquiry into the Moscow trials in 1937, where he was explaining his and Stalin's roles. And he said, quote, "Neither Stalin nor I find ourselves in our present position by accident. We did not create these positions. Each of us is drawn into this drama as a representative of definite ideas and principles. In their turn, the ideas and principles did not fall from the sky, but have profound social roots. That is why one must take not the psychological abstraction of Stalin as a man, but his concrete historical personality as leader of the Soviet bureaucracy. One can understand the acts of Stalin only by starting from the conditions of existence of the new privileged stratum, greedy for material comforts, apprehensive for its position, fearing the masses, and mortally hating all opposition."
It's a great quote. I kind of wish I'd used it in my book. Um, and I think it's the correct perspective, because I do actually rely a bit on Trotsky's biography of Stalin, which his assassination prevented him from completing it. And one thing that very interested me in the biography of Stalin, which is a bit unpolished at times, again, it's incomplete, but he's describing Stalin, as this, he is an activist in the underground Bolshevik party, but he's more kind of this committee man, he's really not this great leader of the masses, and he's certainly not this major theoretician, but he plays a role. And after the revolution and civil war, there's kind of this, again, there's a political vacuum that leads to the rise of the bureaucracy. And this kind of this narrow theoretician, this narrow bureaucrat like Stalin is actually able to become like this arbiter, this spokesperson, leader of the bureaucracy. And what kind of interests me about how Trotsky explained this is like Stalin is playing this role, but because he really doesn't have this kind of grand vision, he's not a grand theoretician, is he doesn't see where it leads. He doesn't understand like this longer term perspective. So Trotsky actually says, and it's one of the points where I argue like he really rejects this demonic approach. He's like, if Stalin in 1924 could see himself in 10 years where the struggle against the opposition would lead to, purges and terror, etc., he would have recoiled in horror with it. And it's basically, I think that's true. If somehow, Stalin isn't this demonic figure, but definite historical material situations shaped him and his role. And for Trotsky, Stalin is not this all-knowing father of peoples who sees the grand sweep of history. No, he's the unwitting agent of historical betrayal. And it's interesting, like, because some anti-communists say, well, behind closed doors, Stalin and company, they all used the language of Marxism, Leninism, and socialism. And they're right. They did use it. That's true. But just because they're using that language doesn't mean that's actually what they're doing. As Marxists, we understand that, in good Hegelian sense, that appearance doesn't equal essence. If we judge people simply by what they say, then silence would be superfluous. We wouldn't need it. But if, Stalin is using a lot of the right phrases all the time, but if you actually look at what he's doing with the purges, with a lot of these compromises, and the same with the wider bureaucracy, it's clear that this is not building socialism. This is not building an egalitarian society, but they certainly believe it. And they certainly think they're playing that role. And that's just a very interesting perspective that takes you away, I think, from like the very fatalistic approaches of both from the blue and the historical necessitarians to a much more, you have to put someone like Stalin or other bureaucrat in their material situation and like how they think they're acting versus how they're actually acting. And I think that's actually very useful. And I think it's actually an underutilized part of Trotsky's corpus of understanding on Stalin, honestly.
Yeah, for sure. The last section of your book deals with the so-called Western Retreat and Eastern Reconciliation. And these were positions that rejected Trotsky's position on the Soviet Union and as you write, it effectively meant an abandonment of revolutionary Marxism. So in this section, among other figures, you write, for example, about Max Shachtman, who he featured quite prominently in your last book, which was about Michael Harrington, the founder of the Democratic Socialists of America. Can you talk more about what these Western retreat and Eastern reconciliation positions looked like and what sort of like conclusions they led to?
Sure. So the Western retreat is basically, you have Trotsky who's saying we defend the planned economy against imperialism, it's our main enemy, but we want the overthrow of the bureaucracy by the workers. And he's still maintaining a revolutionary Marxist perspective of international revolution. But if you say lose like the whole idea that, that we need to that the workers are going to overthrow the bureaucracy, and you just kind of accept that it's maybe a greater evil, that Stalinism and the Soviet Union is greater evil than Western imperialism, you kind of end up with what I call Western retreat. Even if you maintain at some level some kind of rhetorical or nominal commitment to socialism, you're going to start to reconcile with Western imperialism. And the person I talked about at length in the book was Victor Serge, who was an anarchist turned Bolshevik. And he had suffered in prison and in exile in Mexico. And he kind of basically retreated from this idea of revolution. He's like, Stalinism is this great evil out to subjugate the world. He's kind of embracing ideas from James Burnham, a lot of anti-communists. And he sees like, we need to fight against like the Viet Minh, against, in Indochina, people like Ho Chi Minh. In France, he's defending Charles de Gaulle, who's fighting the communists, during these elections. And the interesting thing about Serge is he's still maintaining a lot of rhetorical nostalgia for Bolshevism. Even in his very last writings, he defends the revolution. But he also sees revolution as outmoded, and he's kind of embracing this position towards anti-communism and social democracy. And to kind of tack on to this, Serge kind of dies in transition. He never quite becomes a full hardline anti-communist, like, we need to use nukes against the Ruskies or something like that. He still is in transition. But I think the trajectory of his life is away from Marxism and socialism towards like a Cold War social democracy. And in the Harrington book, I talk at length about Max Shachtman, who he had started in the Trotskyist movement, and he had split from Trotsky in 1940 over the Soviet Union and the invasion of Finland and Poland. And Shachtman eventually adopted this position that the Soviet Union was this new bureaucratic collectivist evil empire. And it was it's a theory, I think, that is totalitarianism dressed up in Marxist garb. And he sees it as a greater evil. And he doesn't kind of jump into it all at once. It takes a lot of time, but the trajectory, once he passed the critical point, he's basically saying this is the greatest evil. So it's kind of bizarre to me that, you see the Red Armies defeating the Wehrmacht after 1943 onward, and he's like bemoaning that it's like a new reign of barbarism. He sees the Communist Party USA as the greatest threat to the U.S. labor movement, not the capitalist class. And he's even offering like this backhanded support for the Korean War. And it's leading, this idea is like corrodes like any like adherence to Marxism of any sort. He abandons a revolutionary transformation of society. And by the 60s, Shachtman himself is supporting the Vietnam War, Richard Nixon. That's pretty far from any support for socialism. And granted, Shachtman, at least at some rhetorical level, kind of supports the transformation of capitalism, but it's very clear where he's aligned with. The Eastern reconciliation is kind of the opposite of this. In the sense, you have someone like Isaac Deutscher, who is a great biographer of Trotsky, Stalin, and one of my favorite writers. But he has this point where he's like, Stalin has driven barbarism out of Russia through barbaric means. And he thinks Stalin is actually this figure of historical necessity, that he was necessary for the Soviet Union. And he hopes, well, after Stalin's death, they'll reform things and, we'll have socialist democracy. But basically, he gives up on like any transformation from below, and he's looking for like the bureaucracy to reform itself, which leads him to defend things like crushing the Berlin workers in 1953, sending in the tanks in 1956. Now, and he gets as far as replacing things like class struggle, internationally with basically geopolitics. So it's the struggle between the Soviet Union and the USA that's the primary factor in world affairs. Now, Deutscher is intelligent. He's not like this crude apologist, but there is a step from him to someone I briefly talk about in the book, but is Sam Marcy, who basically is an uncritical supporter of like the Soviet Union, China, etc. And they see any opposition to it as basically criminal. And it takes very extreme forms in groups like Workers' World. So the Eastern Reconciliation is looking for hopes in bureaucratic reform in Deutscher. And he supports peaceful protest, but in someone like Marcy is basically send in the tanks. We love Brezhnev and Xi and all of this stuff. And if you think about it, they've given like their idea of socialism is like current day China. It's the Soviet Union in the 70s, which are not really super inspiring examples of a liberated society, I would argue. And it's downright apologetic in the sense of the mainline communist parties. So there is kind of this reconciliation. I guess Marcy is this prodigal Stalinist son coming home, if you want to put it like that.
So Stalin died around 70 years ago. So he died in 1953. And like you were saying earlier in our conversation, there was some liberalization and there was an end to like these mass purges. And it's not the case that the Soviet Union was the same from the 1930s until 1991. It's obviously kind of beyond the scope of this particular conversation to talk about capitalist restoration in the Soviet Union, but at the same time, the Stalinist states did not move towards socialism even after Stalin died in 1953. So I wanted to ask why this didn't happen, and if I may use like a term that I find very obnoxious, but if I could play devil's advocate for a moment, could people use this as evidence to say that, well, socialism, it's impossible?
So after Stalin dies, you have the rise of Nikita Khrushchev in the Soviet Union and his secret speech. And he makes some kind of tepid, half-hearted criticism. Well, some of the criticisms of Stalin are very tepid and half-hearted. He likes what Stalin does in the 1920s. He likes socialism in the country, but he doesn't like the purges, particularly against loyal party members. So under Khrushchev, you do see liberalization in the cultural sphere. There's a loosening up there. The mass terror basically ends in the Soviet Union. But Khrushchev never questions the legitimacy of the overall system. And remember, when he does criticize the purges, he's criticizing the purges of loyal party members. People like Bukharin, Trotsky, they all had it coming. So he's not willing to criticize the overall system, because if they were to do that, it would question like the place of the bureaucracy and the party apparatus and their complicity in it. So they want to loosen up so they can replace kind of the autocratic rule of the late Stalin with like a more oligarchic rule, like where the bureaucracy in a wider sphere can kind of rule the Soviet Union. And in Hungary, this liberalization kind of sparks a revolution, which has a lot of different forces involved, from reform communists to very reactionary nationalists to other kind of worker revolutionaries. And that's threatening the whole apparatus of the Hungarian People's Republic. And Khrushchev eventually kind of comes around to sending in the tanks, and they crush it and they restore, the People's Republic and the party rule there. But there are other attempts in Eastern Europe, like in Poland. In 1956, they actually have a reform leader who comes in. They do loosen up a bit. And later in 1968, you have an attempt by Alexander Dubček in Czechoslovakia, something called the Prague Spring, where the party is actually leading like this democratization process. And they're proceeding very cautiously, but it's still too much for the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, and they send in the tanks. So that was an effort actually within the party to reform. And later you have Gorbachev, who tries some kind of reform from above, but I think it's with Gorbachev, it's a question of like how much he maybe believed it and whether he abandoned it at certain points. And it certainly opens up forces in the bureaucracy to basically restore capitalism. I think it's kind of mistaken, just like it is mistaken in terms of capitalism, to expect like the ruling layer to kind of willingly give up its privileges and open the way up to Soviet democracy. And I think that if you accept that Stalinism is the only path to communism, if you accept that, and you look at these various efforts in Khrushchev, in Czechoslovakia, etc., you could say, you know what, they tried to reform it, it didn't work. Well, it's because you're kind of looking at this very top-down kind of politics. We were expecting the bureaucrats to fix it for you. But if we're Marxist, I think we're kind of looking at the ability of the organized working class to liberate and emancipate itself. And if you look at the Soviet Union, there were alternatives in the 20s, such as Trotsky in the 30s as well. So you had different paths that could have been taken. So if you're looking for the bureaucracy to fix things, to liberate, to actually restore Soviet democracy, it's really not going to happen. And I think even if you look at attempts I don't talk about in the book, but elsewhere, like in Cuba or China with like Che Guevara or the Cultural Revolution, they're not, especially the Cultural Revolution, it's willing to shake things up, but it's not willing to ultimately overthrow the party state rule, the rule of the bureaucracy. And those forces, who are willing to do so are essentially marginalized, if not crushed. So I think those possibilities do exist. And I think if we imagine a future of socialism, we have to look at, even in the Bolshevik Revolution, there were alternatives where Stalin could have been opposed. And if we're just viewing it through the narrow prism of whether this bureaucrat is in control or that bureaucrat, then yeah, in a sense, you're never going to get socialism if that's what you rely on. But if you're in a classical Marxist sense, looking at the working class as the agent of history, then yeah, there is still a possibility for it. There are alternatives. We shouldn't adopt like this narrow like fatalism of the anti-communists or the Stalinists. We should reject that and actually understand to a real approach to historical necessity that does see that there are possibilities, there are roads that can be taken, and that the working class can actually change the world. And there were these incipient attempts, in Hungary in '56 and elsewhere to potentially overthrow the bureaucracy, which did not happen for various reasons. So that would be my answer to that question.
A very compelling answer, I would say. And so my last question is more of a meta question about these debates in this topic. So obviously these days there are very few Stalinist states left, but at the same time, Stalinism is still a pretty hot topic that divides the left. And there's some people who say we need to move on from this debate about Stalinism. Other people might say, we're just engaging in like socialist insider baseball by studying these historical figures and their perspectives and things like that. But why is this debate still relevant, and why did you write this book?
Great question. There's a number of ways to answer that. So first, in terms of the states that still proclaim themselves Marxist, Leninist, or Stalinist, we shouldn't discount their existence, particularly China. It's the most populous country in the world. It has an enormous economy. And for good or for ill, I think largely for ill, it's still defining a lot of its policies as in line with Marxism and socialism. And we actually need to deal with that. We actually need to confront the existence of China. And furthermore, yes, a lot of the mainline communist parties have shrunk or collapsed, but in a lot of parts of the world, there are actually still mass forces in India, in Japan, in South Africa, in Chile, Portugal, Greece. I could go on, but these are still parties that to one degree or another still proclaim themselves Marxist-Leninists, and they are still defending various aspects of the Soviet experience that, we as Trotskyists may not defend. So we actually do need to confront them and deal with those questions. And furthermore, I at one point in my life, I was definitely of the school, like, listen, the Soviet Union collapsed a long time ago. Trotsky and Stalin was even longer than that. They're all dead. Why does this debate even matter? Why do we care about this? And certainly there are those weirdos on Twitter who get into this at that kind of like LARPing level, etc. But it's actually an important question because I look at it like this. Say you have someone who's completely new to socialism and communism. They're not a hardline anti-communist, but they actually are interested in this. They come to you or me and they ask us, well, this sounds like a good idea, but isn't it just going to end in totalitarianism and gulags and all this bad stuff? And I think we need to actually be able to answer that, not in the sense that we need to own Stalin and Stalinism and the crimes associated with it, but we actually need to argue soberly with materialist analysis, the origin of Stalinism, how it's actually not socialism and communism. And we also need to be able to debunk these very extreme anti-communist positions on, say, the Ukraine famine or the purges or the Soviet Union, which I did try and do in my book. And I think we need to do this partly to argue that, listen, Stalinism was not this historical destiny of communism, but there were alternatives and possibilities. So to get to your final part of the question is, my book was meant as part of the debate on this. I don't cover every single theorist, otherwise the book would be 20 times longer than it was. But I do cover, I think, a fair number of major theorists, whether anti-communists, communists, Trotskyists, etc. And to understand, what are the major schools of historical necessity of Bolt from the Blue and, the historical materialist approach of Trotsky, and to kind of, as a navigation tool, to get us to a point where we can reject as basically mirror images the Bolt from the Blue and the necessity. They both share the same underlying fatalism, that there is no alternative. And we should actually say, listen, we can reject the anti-communism, but we don't have to defend Stalinism. We can reject, a lot of this apologetics and still maintain, our critical approach. And we should do this because actually truly understand historical necessity and that the alternatives do exist in every revolution, then the future, the possibilities for revolution and liberation, emancipation are still open for us. Communism can still be our future. And that is why I wrote the book, For Communism.
I think that's a really beautiful place to end it. I wanted to know where people can find your book, and I would also, of course, be very keen to know what you're working on next and what I can look forward to interviewing you about next time on this podcast.
Okay, wonderful. So the book is available from Rowman and Littlefield, which you could get on their website or Amazon. It is in hardcover, so it is a bit expensive, but I'm hoping to generate enough interest for a cheaper paperback release. So write to the publisher saying you want a paperback, write to your library asking them to order copies and review the book, interview me to generate this kind of interest, for a future paperback release. And in terms of a future project, I actually do have a forthcoming book. It has been accepted on Kautsky and this neo-Kautskyist school on Marxism and Bolshevism. So if you're interested in people like Lars Lee, Eric Blanc, and Karl Kautsky himself, that's what this book is about, and kind of the Bolshevik or the classical Marxist critique of Kautsky. And I don't have a release date yet for you, but I will let you know. But I'm very excited about it because I think it's long overdue to have a book on this subject.
Absolutely, yeah. I feel like that is an extremely timely and pertinent topic, for sure. Thank you so much for being here. This was really, really interesting, and look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you so much.